I read things like, Jeffrey West's scale, where it says that economic growth is inherently unsustainable. You try to innovate your way through it, but you'll reach some limits. But then I read things like Andrew McAfee's More from Less, where it says, hey, we've now decoupled resource consumption or resource usage from consumption, and I don't know who to believe. Or it's not that I don't know who to believe, but who's right? Which do we have to innovate through it? Is the only way out is through, or do you have to have this radical reformation of how we run our economy, more Charles Eisenstein stuff? And so that's my question to you, Dan. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so let's talk about limits of growth and upper bounds and that kind of question. So obviously the growth of the materials economy in the domain of atoms is different than in the domain of bits. And we would be silly to not acknowledge that fundamental difference. And there's a third difference. In terms of the physics of the materials economy, the domain of atoms, the domain of energy, and the domain of bits all have fundamentally different scarcities and different thermodynamics associated, different conservation laws. So we have to have different accounting for them. We have a finite amount of atoms of various types. And of course, via better mining technologies and whatever, and turning the atoms into molecules, so better chemistry type technologies, we can modulate that to some degree, but we also have upper bounds on that. It's also important to realize that it's not just getting the atoms, it's what do we do with them after the fact, which is the waste management. So for the most part, so far, humanity's had a linear materials economy where we take resources out of the earth in a way that are not renewing themselves, which is ultimately causing net depletion. And then we use them for some finite period of time, and then we put them back into the earth in a way that they can't actually be reabsorbed properly, so toxicity, net accumulation. The depletion and accumulation in the ecosystem, where the ecosystem before humans doing a materials economy had closed loop processes. The animals, the plants, the funguses, everything in an ecosystem are made of the same atomic ingredients and can be fully recycled. And so anything dies and it becomes food for new things, and the food for new things doesn't try to figure out how to mine and get like savings accounts in very effective ways because they don't have tool innovation. So you get these kind of closed loop processes that is a huge part of the anti-fragility of how ecologies work. So obviously we have to move from a linear materials economy to a closed loop economy. That's pretty straightforward, where we take responsibility for closed loop on the atomic cycles. So we aren't producing accumulation on one side or depletion on the other. Now, we can keep cycling them. So we don't have a situation that once we've used it, it's gone, right? But we do have a situation where we start moving from increased growth of the number of atoms, measuring growth or progress in terms of the number of atoms, to that the atoms are being put into continuously more interesting forms. The forms are defined by design that is stored in a pattern of bits. And obviously the bits don't have a similar type of fundamental limit to them than the atoms do. So atoms we have to think about closed loop accounting on. Now, to be able to process the old stuff into new stuff atomically takes energy. Energy has a different kind of conservation to it, which is that we get a finite amount of energy bandwidth every day. We can use it more efficiently, solar and other types of things, but we don't have an indefinite amount of energy. So we have to be cycling the atoms within a limited energetic bandwidth, and we have basically unlimited amount of bit pattern, limited only by the energy and atom needs of the computational substrate. But then the bits are only useful insofar as they can actually be put into form, and or there is limited human attention to be able to engage them as types of software. And so human attention becomes another fundamental scarcity that is part of this equation. And so when people look at things like the fundamentally non-rivalrous nature of software, you can't abstract that to the domain of energy or atoms, right? Like you really have to think about these and the accounting of them differently. The moment you think about attention as a scarce resource to compete over monetizing, everything gets evil and fucked in a hurry, as we see in the world with all of the problems associated with social media type dynamics and marketing, because monetizing other people's attention, which is obviously at the heart of the idea of marketing, right? But not just marketing, propaganda in a government way, and the desire to control other people's behavior for personal benefit, the benefit of the corporation or the political party or the whatever it is. But if I am a political party, or I'm Google or Facebook, or I'm an advertiser on there, and I'm a multi-billion-dollar kind of organization employing tools of radical asymmetric advantage to be able to use the most effective hypernormal stimuli to cause addiction and entrapment to, all the stuff Tristan Harris and those folks talk about to people, there's a kind of asymmetric information and narrative warfare for people's attention. And you notice that there's no definition of consciousness you can give that's meaningful, that doesn't require defining attention, or a definition of choice. So attention is very fundamental to what it means to be human and what it means to have any kind of sovereignty. So using asymmetrically powerful tools to capture and direct and split test optimize how effectively you were able to capture and direct someone else's attention is trying to put any degree of free will or choice they have under your control for a purpose that benefits you and not them. And again, as an asymmetric type warfare. So we have to stop thinking about the attention economy that way. And now we can start to look at why we think of it that way and what would it take to change the macroeconomics underneath that. So are there fundamental limits of growth? Yes. Can we create more efficiency to where those limits are extending but still bounded? Yes. And so you will get to a place of diminishing returns on the increased efficiency, where we don't have increased resource per capita multiplied by increased population on a linear or an exponential curve forever. We'll get diminishing return. And so we do have to think about planetary boundaries in a intelligent way.